There are moments in life when the deepest stillness you experience is not peace, but the cold absence of everything. You don't feel broken, but you certainly don't feel fine. You only recognize that you are absent, gone from your own self. This quiet collapse is the most disorienting experience of the modern mind, because nobody prepared us for a pain that comes disguised as nothing at all. Your feelings have stopped being a storm. They have become a locked room. You are sitting there, perfectly still. And the most unsettling part is that you have forgotten where you put the key. You begin to fear that the emptiness isn't temporary. You fear that the void is who you fundamentally are. This phenomenon, this emotional shutdown, this muted existence, is often severely misunderstood. People assume emotional numbness looks like a visible, dramatic crisis. But for the vast majority of us, it is incredibly subtle. It is invisible, particularly in a culture like ours, a culture that relentlessly rewards performance and composure. Sometimes it looks like sitting in your sunlit apartment in a place like Brooklyn or Austin, staring at the textured wall, feeling neither sad nor particularly happy, just suspended in a lukewarm, neutral state. Other times, it looks like a psychological reflex. You force yourself to laugh because the social situation demands it, or you simulate enthusiasm because you know that is the expected script for the weekend. You tell a friend, "I'm okay." Not necessarily because you're lying, but because you genuinely cannot articulate what "not okay" would even look like in this quiet vacuum. Your entire emotional lexicon has been edited down to a single, vacant word. We have to internalize this truth. This numbness is not a sign of emotional weakness. It is a profound signal of emotional exhaustion. You haven't chosen to feel nothing. Your mind, your sophisticated internal system, has made that choice for you. It has concluded that feeling anything, whether intense joy or profound sorrow, has become too costly, too risky, or simply too heavy for the system to bear right now. The subtle tragedy of this numbness is the internal contradiction it creates. Some people grow so accustomed to this neutral state that they begin to mistake it for their core identity. They start telling themselves, "This is just how I am," or "Maybe I'm just a colder, more logical person." But when you begin to study the complex machinery of the mind, as we do here at MindRabbit, you realize that emotional numbness is not a personality trait. It is a protective signal, a desperate automated message from your deepest self saying, "I must shelter you from something you are not currently equipped to feel or hold." Most of the world thinks the opposite of feeling is apathy, but that is where the truth becomes critically distorted. Apathy is the state where you genuinely don't care about the outcome, the people, or the world around you. Emotional numbness, however, is a state where you want to care, but the mechanism to access and express that care is temporarily shut down. You are keenly aware of the emotional distance and you long to cross it, but something inside has deliberately turned off the switch, creating a psychological moat around your heart. This difference is everything. It reveals that the core problem is not a lack of humanity, but a survival reflex. We are not built to be emotionless voids. We are built to endure, and often that endurance requires us to survive emotions that are simply too enormous, too complex, or too constant for us to hold in our immediate conscious awareness. This suspension is the mind's way of buying critical time. Think of it as the mind activating safe mode. If you were driving and the engine light came on, you wouldn't blame the light. You would recognize it as a signal about the engine. Emotional numbness is that engine light. It is telling you that the internal processing load has exceeded the system's capacity. It is saying that you have been strong for too long, carrying too many burdens without ever granting yourself the permission to truly put them down. When the body reaches physical collapse, it simply falls. When the mind reaches emotional exhaustion, it does something far more subtle and sophisticated. It shuts the doors. It creates distance. It enters a low-power mode, not to punish you, but to keep you minimally functional. This ability to dial down the internal emotional volume is, in a strange way, one of the most advanced forms of mental endurance. It means your mind, your nervous system, refused to break. It simply chose to mute the impact instead. And for many of us, navigating the constant low-grade stress of modern life, the economic anxiety, the demands of the hyper-productive economy, this muted state becomes the only viable strategy. It is not coldness, it is an exhausted heart wrapped in a temporary layer of insulation. this profound state of emotional depletion, where both the capacity for joy and the permission for sorrow are equally flattened, is the core pain we must articulate. It is a loneliness that sits right next to the person you love, a disconnection that exists while you are at the dinner table with your family. It is the silence that feels heavier than any noise. We are here not to fix it, but to observe it without judgment, and to understand the brilliant, albeit exhausting mechanism at work beneath the surface. This silent suffering is the first step toward recognizing what your mind has been trying to protect you from. Now, let us move from the definition of this quiet pain to the architecture of the experience itself. I want to take you somewhere intensely familiar, a moment that should have been incredibly significant, yet was rendered meaningless by this internal shutdown. Picture this scene in your mind. It might be a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Maybe you're sitting in a coffee shop in Seattle, staring out the window, and you are waiting for a moment to arrive. You are waiting specifically for the feeling to arrive. Perhaps you just submitted a major proposal, the kind that cost you months of late nights and early mornings, the kind that was supposed to bring immense professional satisfaction and relief, the kind that society dictates is the definition of making it. The moment lands. The confirmation email pops up on your screen. You look at the words and you feel nothing. Not the rush of victory, not the quiet hum of gratitude, just a flat line. The mental state is identical to waiting for a delayed flight you already know you are going to miss. The moment passes without a ripple, swallowed whole by the pervasive neutral. Or consider a moment of genuine, unavoidable loss. A painful goodbye that should have been gut-wrenching, an ending to a long, complex relationship, or a quiet farewell to a deep, lifelong friendship. You brace yourself for the impact. You prepare for the tidal wave of grief, anger, or existential fear, the necessary difficult emotions that signify closure and healing. You wait for the collision, and it never comes. Instead, there is only a strange, persistent silence, a kind of mental emptiness that feels fundamentally unnatural. It is as if your conscious mind, or some deeper layer of your nervous system, stepped physically between you and the incoming emotional wave and calmly, mechanically stated, "Not today. We cannot afford this. Not right now." That is the true cinematic imagery of emotional numbness. It's not about grand dramatic collapses. It is about the subtle, relentless muting of the internal soundtrack. It's the difference between hearing a full, vibrant symphony and hearing the same music played through 3 layers of sound-dampening foam. You recognize the notes, you know the music is there, but the resonance, the depth, the warmth, it's all gone. Think of it using the submerged city metaphor we spoke of. You are living in a place where all the signals, sounds, and connections are perfectly real, but they are viewed through a dense, quiet layer of water. The world looks the same. Your colleagues are still talking, the traffic is still moving, people are still embracing and communicating, but the color is muted, the sound is muffled, and the sensation of gravity is heavy and slow. You are there, physically present, but you are not participating in the atmosphere. You are observing it from a different medium, a different depth. This feeling of being behind glass or perpetually underwater perfectly captures the quiet loneliness we spoke of earlier. You see the sparks of joy in others, the intensity of their conviction, the depth of their connection, and a core, fundamental human part of you wants desperately to feel that spark, wants to be vulnerable to that anger, wants to experience that depth. But you simply cannot connect the way you used to. Your emotional depth charge is simply failing to detonate. This happens because the human mind, placed in a state of prolonged stress, trauma, or emotional overwhelm, develops what is essentially a habit of defense. It's a survival reflex. When the stakes are constantly high, when the disappointment is repeated and the expectations are unrelenting, the mind learns that the safest strategy is internal silence. Not just silence from others, but silence within yourself. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this internal shutdown is often automated, bypassing your conscious decision-making entirely. When something stressful, confusing, or too demanding happens, your mind reverts to the established survival program: numbness. It is the same survival reflex that causes your body to shut down pain during physical shock. You are not broken for feeling nothing. You are simply witnessing an advanced, complex defense system doing precisely what it was trained to do. But the real loneliness settles in when you start internalizing this distance. You look at the lack of response inside you, the absence of the expected grief, the missing excitement, and you begin to feel truly isolated. How do you explain to someone that you care about them profoundly, but you cannot feel the warmth of that caring? How do you explain that you are not cold, but merely exhausted beyond the capacity for connection? You find yourself replying to texts, going through the daily routines, yet feeling profoundly disconnected. You are surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. You are the only inhabitant of the submerged city. This internal reality, this strange, flat quietness, is the psychological landscape that precedes and defines anhedonia. It is the slow, almost imperceptible turning away from the emotional world, a quiet withdrawal that happens not during the big crashes, but during the long, slow, grinding periods of persistent stress. It is a low-grade, emotional frostbite. You do not notice the feeling fading until you suddenly wake up one morning and realize the sensation is gone, leaving behind only the strange, empty landscape of the submerged city. This is the stage upon which the nervous system will now take center stage. Now, we move beyond the emotional scenery and into the underlying mechanics. This is where the quiet intensity of MindRabbit often takes hold, transforming personal confusion into shared, understandable biological logic. The question isn't, what is wrong with me, but rather, what is my nervous system actively trying to tell me? The mind's ability to create emotional numbness is not magic. It is pure, sophisticated biology, a profound and necessary act of neural conservation. Think of your emotional system, your sense of self, and your capacity for joy as a complex electrical grid, and your brain is the main control center. The energy required to process deep grief, immense fear, sustained stress, or even profound, complex joy is enormous. It demands immediate, significant resources. When this system is constantly overloaded, not just for a few hours, but for weeks, months, or even years due to constant external demands, your brain, the ultimate efficiency manager, initiates an emergency protocol. This is the principle of the emotional circuit breaker. When the demands exceed the capacity, when the emotional current is too high, the system doesn't try to power through and burn out the delicate emotional wiring. That would be catastrophic. Instead, it systematically flips the main circuit breaker. This shutdown is deliberate. It drastically reduces the flow of energy to the most resource-intensive areas, which happen to be the emotional processing centers. This is your mind saying, I am taking us offline for essential maintenance, and I must prioritize core, non-negotiable survival functions over quality of life or depth of feeling. This process directly explains the core symptom of anhedonia, which is defined as the loss of the capacity for pleasure or interest. The biological problem lies not in the experience of pleasure, but in the mechanism of anticipation and motivation. The key player here is the reward circuitry, primarily mediated by the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical. That's a simplification. It is the seeking chemical, the motivation fuel. It is what makes you anticipate a reward, look forward to an event, or feel the internal drive to pursue a goal. Dopamine is the energy that drives the pursuit. In a state of prolonged stress, trauma, or emotional exhaustion, the sensitivity and function of the entire dopamine system become profoundly suppressed. It is not that you physically can't feel joy when it happens, but rather that your system no longer generates the necessary surge of dopamine to create the sense that pursuing joy is worth the monumental effort. This is the deeper commentary that elevates the understanding. You do not lose the joy. You lose the energy to want the joy. If pursuing an activity, a hobby, a social outing, a long-term passion project, previously required 5 units of mental energy and delivered 10 units of dopamine reward, the transaction was clearly worthwhile. But when the system is depleted, that exact same activity now requires 10 units of mental energy because you are chronically fatigued, and only delivers 3 units of dopamine because the reward circuitry is suppressed. The transaction becomes grossly inefficient, and the brain, being ruthlessly logical, stops initiating the action. This is why you can be watching a film you used to love, surrounded by people who care about you, yet feel utterly bored and detached. Your system is rationally deciding that the effort required to engage is not justified by the potential reward. It is a logical, albeit brutal, conservation strategy. Furthermore, chronic stress severely impacts the prefrontal cortex, PFC, the region of your brain responsible for executive functions like planning, emotional regulation, and integrating complex information. When the PFC is overwhelmed by stress hormones like cortisol, it becomes sluggish and less effective at filtering and processing the constant input of emotional data. Instead of navigating the complexity of a situation with nuance, I am disappointed by this outcome, but deeply grateful for the effort. The exhausted brain defaults to the simplest, most energy-efficient response: mute. It is psychologically and biologically easier for the depleted PFC to simply turn the entire volume knob to zero than to perform the delicate, resource-intensive work of selective processing and regulation. Therefore, your emotional numbness is not a moral failure or a sign of being inherently cold. It is a biological, observable consequence. It is the visible result of a central nervous system that has been pushed beyond its limits and has activated an internal emergency shutdown, protecting its most critical, non-renewable resource: its energy. The silence you feel is the sound of your internal machinery, prioritizing sheer survival over sensation. This understanding, that the core is functional but the mechanism is suspended, is the critical first step toward compassionately inviting the feelings back. Now, we move from the biological and mechanical facts to the deeper psychological context. If the numb state is a sophisticated defense system, the most urgent question becomes, what precisely is it defending us from? The answer is almost always emotional overwhelm, and the deeply ingrained, often subconscious, lessons that teach us that expressing our feelings is simply not safe. When psychologists examine individuals reporting long-term emotional numbness, the unifying threads that bind their stories together are not always major, dramatic trauma, but often a complex tapestry of persistent, low-grade, unacknowledged stressors: long-term job stress, the grinding fatigue of repeated disappointment, environments of emotional invalidation, or early life contexts where showing true feeling was met with confusion, dismissal, or, worst of all, punishment. In such environments, particularly during formative, vulnerable years, a child's mind makes a crucial, high-stakes calculation. Emotions are a liability. If vulnerability consistently leads to being ignored, misunderstood, or shamed, the safest, most resource-efficient strategy becomes internal silence. The developing mind learns to suppress feelings not out of personal choice, but out of absolute necessity for psychological survival. This is a brilliant coping mechanism, a necessary adaptation that allows the individual to keep functioning. But that same adaptive pattern often follows us into adulthood, becoming an automatic, unconscious, and now counterproductive reflex. When an adult faces a stressful, demanding, or ambiguous situation, perhaps a tense negotiation, a difficult family conversation, or simply the crushing, silent weight of modern expectations, the mind automatically triggers the established survival habit: numbness. It is a conditioned response. The subconscious mind effectively concludes, I have encountered this emotional storm before, and last time. It almost broke us. I will preemptively shut down the sensor to prevent the overload. This leads to the paradox where numbness is not the absence of emotion, but the presence of too much unprocessed emotion. It is the mind's backlog. It is similar to a computer hard drive that is 99% full. It can no longer accept new files, new feelings, or new complex data, not because the hardware is broken, but because it lacks the necessary space and computational power to process and store them effectively. The emotional overflow is contained by simply refusing to recognize the incoming data. The feeling of being behind a glass wall, which we discussed earlier, becomes particularly profound here. This wall is built from the cumulative weight of the moments that hurt too much, the disappointments you didn't have time or safety to fully grieve, and the responsibilities you carried entirely alone. It is a shield, not an empty void, and shields by their very design keep things out, but they also relentlessly keep things in. Psychological literature introduces the concept of emotional blunting. This is the state where both the high peaks of positive emotion and the deep troughs of negative emotion are flattened. You simply exist in the steady middle. You become predictable, reliable, and functional. The ideal employee, the composed friend, the stable partner. This state is often psychologically comfortable because predictability requires minimal energy. When you are numb, there is no crushing fear, no acute heartbreak, and, crucially, no vulnerability. This comfort can, however, become a serious psychological trap. Numbness isn't always intensely unpleasant. For many, it evolves into a quiet, low-maintenance, and low-risk way of existing. When you've lived through enough emotional storms, the quiet, muted atmosphere of the submerged city can feel like a welcome, albeit temporary, refuge. You effectively trade potential joy for guaranteed stability. The mind, however, abhors a vacuum. When the natural emotional flow is blocked, the mind attempts to fill that emptiness, and it often does so with activities that mimic purpose or sensation. Constant productivity and busyness, burying oneself in work, achievement, and deadlines. Chronic distraction, seeking constant, low-stakes entertainment. Binge-watching, endless scrolling. Intellectualization, staying strictly in the head, analyzing and overthinking emotions rather than descending into the body to feel them. Everyone copes differently, but the underlying goal is identical: to avoid the silence inside. The silence, when finally faced, contains the immense, unprocessed weight that the numbness was initially designed to contain. This is why, when someone asks if you are okay, you say yes, not because you are fooling them, but because you are running a constant subconscious energy audit. You don't have the mental reserves to open the file labeled emotional state, let alone explain its complex, resource-intensive contents. You are deeply tired, emotionally tired, and that fatigue is the real culprit, the profound force that has flipped the internal circuit breaker. You are not cold, you are simply running on empty. And in this depleted state, preservation becomes the only imperative. Here we arrive at the pivotal insight, the one that defines the MindRabbit perspective on the modern, high-pressure condition, the profound, quiet exhaustion that hides beneath a perfect facade of competence. We call this the hollow feeling beneath high-functioning burnout. Our modern American society, particularly in the competitive professional landscape, actively praises the very symptoms of emotional numbness. We celebrate the individual who never complains, the person who always meets the deadline regardless of personal stress, and the leader who maintains unshakable composure under extreme duress. We mistakenly equate the absence of emotional output with true inner strength and resilience. The irony is brutal, and it must be acknowledged. The most effective, highest-performing individuals are often the most internally hollow. This is where the concept of busyness as a shield becomes central to the discussion. If you keep moving, if you keep achieving, you ensure that you never have to feel. Achievement, new deadlines, and overwhelming responsibility become powerful insulation materials. They wrap tightly around the quiet collapse inside, effectively preventing the external world, and crucially, your own conscious awareness, from noticing the systemic depletion. The mind creates this strategy with ruthless efficiency. If I commit to an unrelenting schedule, if I always volunteer for the next major responsibility, I will guarantee that there is no psychological space for the old feelings, the old grief, the old disappointments, the old vulnerability to return and take root. You are running an emotional marathon, not primarily for the sake of the finish line, but to actively avoid the exhaustion that would hit you if you ever dared to stop running. People commend your discipline, your work ethic, and your apparent resilience without realizing that the true, staggering emotional cost is near total depletion. The absence of complaint is not a measure of strength. It is the silence of an exhausted system that no longer has the resources for even a small internal protest. You are being universally praised for your productivity while you are internally suffering from preservation. This insight radically challenges the fundamental narrative of strength we are taught. True, enduring strength is not the capacity to mute your feelings. It is the capacity to safely and effectively process them. Numbness, in this context, is the mind's desperate strategy to maintain a perfect mask of external control while internally hemorrhaging vital energy. The person experiencing this high-functioning numbness is often deeply compassionate, and this is a direct, observable result of the psychological process we've outlined. When the mind blocks access to internal emotions, it often heightens its sensitivity to external emotional states. The mind needs data to function, and if its primary source, your own feelings, is cut off, it aggressively seeks emotional data elsewhere. This explains the phenomenon where someone who feels utterly detached from their own sorrow can be intensely, almost surgically empathetic toward a grieving friend. They are not cold, they are protective. They can accurately read the complex map of someone else's emotional terrain, even if they have temporarily lost the coordinates for their own. Their heart hasn't vanished. It is simply enclosed in a quiet layer of insulation, working as a highly sensitive external radar system, while the internal emotional sensors are offline. This psychological dynamic leads us to a crucial question that demands introspection. What are you truly accomplishing by being endlessly strong, endlessly busy, and endlessly composed? You are not broken for being this exhausted. You are not cold for being numb. You are simply someone who has cared, carried, and felt for too long without having a safe, designated place to put all that tenderness, responsibility, and emotional labor down. Eventually, even the most resilient heart needs to stop being the one that always feels everything first, carries everything longest, and hides everything deepest. The mind steps in, not to punish you, but to save you. It wraps the heart in that quiet layer of insulation to grant you the necessary room to breathe, a crucial pause. This pause, this numbness, is the highest form of mental endurance. Your mind is telling you, I refuse to let you break. I refuse to let everything hit you at once. I created distance, silence, and space for you to heal. The difficulty lies in the fact that this silence can feel endless, and the hardest part is not knowing when, or even if, the feelings will ever return. But the truth is, the feelings were never truly gone. They were simply waiting for the silence to be gentle enough for the heart to open again. And that gentleness is the necessary internal environment that we must now begin to cultivate. The pervasive quiet of emotional numbness naturally leads to a profound, unspoken fear, not of the numbness itself, but of its potential reversal. This is the stage where the survival mechanism of shutdown morphs into a fixed psychological avoidance strategy. We call this the fear of emotion returning, and it is one of the most potent subconscious barriers to self-reconnection. Many people who have lived successfully in the controlled, predictable environment of emotional numbness secretly harbor a deep, core anxiety. If I let one emotion back in, even a flicker of happiness, it will all return at once. They fear not just the sorrow, but the entirety of the unprocessed history, the intense stress, the unexpressed frustration, the dormant memories, and the overwhelming complexity that caused the initial shutdown. This fear is entirely rational from the brain's perspective. It is the protective part of the mind shouting a clear warning. If we turn the circuit breaker back on, the system, which is still running on low energy, will overload and catastrophically burn out for good. This defensive stance generates a strange, self-limiting paradox. The fear of feeling becomes psychologically stronger than the desire to feel. You still desire joy, deep connection, and warmth, but those positive experiences are psychologically bundled with immense risk. Joy requires vulnerability. Connection requires openness. Love, in its true form, requires the acceptance that eventual loss or disappointment is always possible. And when someone has lived through enough emotional storms, enough systemic disappointment, even a moment of bright, unfiltered emotional sunshine can feel dangerous, because it implies the possibility of an equally painful shadow. This avoidance manifests in clear, predictable psychological patterns. Avoidance of vulnerability. You keep conversations inherently shallow, rarely discussing anything that matters deeply, because deep connection necessitates the risk of being truly seen and potentially rejected or hurt. Avoidance of change. You stick rigidly to routines and predictable paths, even if they are fundamentally unsatisfying, because any significant change might awaken dormant emotions you don't know how to handle. Avoidance of deep love or commitment. You instinctively pull back from the possibility of deep affection, because love is the ultimate commitment to risk. If you don't fully attach, you can't be fully devastated. This is a quiet, chronic form of self-sabotage, driven by the mind's highest, non-negotiable directive: security over sensation. This state of detachment also involves a subtle, yet common psychological pattern known as dissociation. Again, this is not the dramatic filmic portrayal of severe mental illness, but a mild, persistent, everyday form of mental distancing. It is the feeling that you are viewing your life through a camera lens or a window, rather than living it. You are present in the room, you can hear, see, and respond, but you are not fully integrated into the immediate sensory and emotional experience. The mind steps back from the immediate reality to avoid being overloaded by the perceived threat of emotional complexity. Many people who repeatedly say, "I don't feel anything," are actually experiencing this quiet, persistent form of dissociation. It is a spatial and temporal trick the mind uses to create a psychological safety gap. However, humans are fundamentally not wired to remain dissociated forever. We are wired for meaning, for deep relational connection, and for the full, messy spectrum of emotional life. This leads us to the most hopeful and essential perspective. The mind does not stay in the state of preservation. It is always seeking reintegration. The numbness you feel is not the end of feeling, it is the beginning of understanding. What if this quietness isn't a failure, but a necessary pause, a deep recalibration? It is the mind saying, "Let me reorganize everything, the old wounds, the survival habits, the overwhelming expectations, before you move forward, before you can safely step into a new, more integrated version of yourself." The old, overwhelming emotional patterns often need to quiet down and settle. The emotional system is not a fragile artifact. It is highly resilient, immensely adaptive, and profoundly responsive. Feelings do not vanish forever. They simply reorganize themselves and wait for the right environment, the right moment, and crucially, the right version of you, the version who is more aware, more grounded, and more capable of holding what comes next. Numbness is a waiting room, not a permanent destination. And if you are currently in that season, you are not stuck, you are transitioning. The heart goes quiet before it learns how to speak again in a new, less defensive language. If emotional numbness is the mind's highest form of preservation, then the path back to feeling cannot be one of force or pressure. Numbness does not respond to demands. It responds only to compassion, fundamental stability, and rest. The vast majority of people who experience this profound, quiet silence find that part of their struggle comes from living in perpetual survival mode for so long that they have genuinely forgotten what true, unforced safety feels like. When your environment, internal or external, has been defined by chronic uncertainty, repeated disappointment, or pervasive emotional unpredictability, numbness becomes a familiar, if chilly, home. You might even feel a misplaced toxic sense of guilt for not feeling anything, a self-judgment that only deepens the numbness, but guilt is entirely misplaced and unproductive. Emotional numbness is not a fault in your character. It is a brilliant, well-learned, and highly adaptive response, shaped entirely by the taxing experiences you have endured. We must consciously stop blaming ourselves for a coping mechanism that, at one point in time, was essential and saved us from complete collapse. The journey toward reawakening is not about fixing anything, but about creating the internal and external conditions for feelings to feel safe enough to return. Feelings do not come back because you force them with willpower. They return because your mind finally stops spending all its energy preparing for the next inevitable impact. This process often begins not with a wave of deep, dramatic emotion, but with physical somatic signals, because the body, which holds the truth, often awakens before the analytical, emotional brain does. You might start noticing small, subtle shifts. A moment where your breathing becomes deeper and more relaxed without your conscious instruction. A sudden, unexpected lightness in your chest or shoulders. The capacity to sleep through the night without the mind running its usual anxious audit. Or simply the ability to truly notice the specific color of the sky, the warmth of the sun, or the texture of the pavement around you again. These are not grand emotional breakthroughs. They are tangible neurological signs that the nervous system is slowly, carefully coming out of conservation mode. Because the mind and body are so intimately connected, When one begins to soften and heal, the other invariably follows suit. There is also an incredible underestimated power in reconnecting with small sensory pleasures. This is not toxic positivity or forced happiness. It is a gentle, almost clinical process of microdosing sensation. Think of the small, simple comforts that require minimal energy and carry almost no risk. A deliberate, slow sip of warm coffee or tea held between your palms. A quiet moment of sunlight hitting a familiar object. The texture of a soft blanket against your skin. The deep, non-judgmental satisfaction of a peaceful thought. These moments are essential because they slip through the cracks of the numb barrier and provide reliable, low-risk data to the dopamine system, reminding it that reward is possible and the transaction is safe and low cost. These small experiences are crucial signs that the internal emotional machinery is slowly, tentatively waking up again. They confirm that you are not missing something fundamental. You are simply transitioning. Transitions are often confusing, they are full of silence, and they absolutely demand patience. The fundamental shift begins when we stop asking demanding, aggressive questions. Why am I like this? What is wrong with me? And instead begin asking softer, more invitational questions. These questions do not demand emotion. They gently invite honest self-inquiry. What am I protecting myself from right now, in this very moment? What part of me feels most tired, most heavy? What is one small thing that would make me feel fundamentally safe and rested right now, even if only for 10 minutes? When was the first time in my life that feeling too much stopped being safe? These inquiries are not about finding a dramatic, clear-cut answer. They are about opening a quiet, non-judgmental, compassionate dialogue with the self that learned to shut down. The version of you that learned to suppress emotions is still trying to protect you. The first act of gentle guidance is to thank that protective part of you for its incredible endurance, and then quietly let it know that its overwhelming duties may, eventually, be reduced. The process of emotional re-entry is often slow, like a flicker of light growing stronger, not a sudden spotlight. For some, feeling returns through music. A favorite song they haven't truly heard in years suddenly strikes a deep chord, giving them a quiet, almost physical feeling they haven't experienced in a long time. For others, it is a meaningful conversation where they realize they are listening with a deeper, less guarded attention than usual. These are not major events. They are subtle signs that the entire emotional world inside you is stirring. The emotional system is inherently and highly resilient. It will return when it senses true readiness and safety. Your only job in this quiet, transitional phase is to nurture the conditions for safety, rest, and compassion, allowing your own inner world to begin its slow, vital process of reorganization. The most profound discoveries in contemporary psychology confirm this fundamental truth. Emotions do not simply vanish or disappear forever into the void. They exist in a state of suspension, waiting for the right internal environment, waiting for the version of you who is more aware, more grounded, and more capable of holding their inherent complexity. But we must conclude this journey with a gentle, final reframing, the deepest observation that only comes after years of watching the human heart protect itself in silence. What nobody truly tells you about the hollow feeling is that emotional numbness is not a sign that you have stopped caring. It is the overwhelming, undeniable evidence that you have been caring for far too long without a safe, consistent, and reliable place to put all that tenderness, responsibility, and emotional weight. Think of it this way. Your heart is not a machine, but a vessel. If you are constantly filling it with unacknowledged grief, suppressed frustration, and the relentless demands of an impossible schedule, and you never grant yourself the essential time or safety to empty it, the vessel must eventually seal itself off and refuse to accept any more input to prevent total flooding. So, the mind, that brilliant, exhausted sentinel, steps in. It wraps the heart in that quiet layer of insulation, not to punish you, not to disconnect you eternally, but to grant you room to breathe. It is a pause button for the self. It is a necessary intervention. You are not broken for feeling nothing. You are simply a resilient system protecting itself in the only way your mind, driven by the imperative of survival and neural conservation, knows how. The silence that you feel can feel endless, and the most common anxiety is the uncertainty of the return. For some, feelings rush back in a wave of sudden warmth and clarity. For others, it is a slow, quiet, almost imperceptible shift, like a flicker of emotion you barely notice. And for many, the numbness fades only when life, or perhaps only when they themselves, become gentle enough for the heart to open its windows again. We live in a culture that relentlessly demands productivity, strength, and unwavering resilience from us. But numbness, that quiet defensive response to overload, does not respond to pressure. It does not respond to force. It only responds to rest, to stability, to moments where your mind finally, truly stops preparing for the next inevitable impact. In the end, emotional numbness is not something to fear, something to be ashamed of, or something to be criticized. It is something to understand, because understanding it brings you closer to the part of you that has been struggling to communicate its desperate need for safety and rest. It helps you realize that you are not empty, you are not cold, you are not a failure. You are protecting something immense, something vital, something truly human. And once you recognize the purpose of that protection, you can begin the slow, careful, and compassionate work of unlocking the feelings again, at your own pace, on your own terms. The heart is still beating, the emotional river is still flowing beneath the layer of ice. And that, I believe, is the quietest, most enduring form of hope we can hold on to.